A summer somewhere in Central Europe. A seemingly happy upper-class family is having the time of their lives in their country house, bathing in the sun, looking at the flowers and indulging in small talk. But there is one problem. There is constant noise coming from behind the wall. You really have to speak louder to make yourself heard. And that is no surprise, because behind the wall is the year 1943 in one of the biggest Nazi concentration camps, Auschwitz. Of course, here I'm talking about the already famous movie The Zone of Interest, about the family of the Auschwitz commandant, which got quite a few awards at the festivals and has even been nominated for the Oscars. If you try to read some of the reviews about this movie, there is a chance of about 153% that the phrase banality of evil that the film kinda embodies will pop up. And that's a bit of a stretch, to say the least, and in this video I'm going to try to explain what's wrong with interpreting this movie and its main characters as embodying the banality of evil as outlined by Hannah Arendt. There's going to be several spoilers in this video, so if you haven't yet seen the film but want to, you might have to save this video and come back a bit later. Now, let's get started, but first things first, what is banality of evil? The concept of banality of evil famously appeared in Hannah Arendt's 1963 book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is mainly a book on the history of Holocaust and Adolf Eichmann's role in it. She argues that despite all of his crimes, Eichmann didn't really look like a stereotypical evil person, like someone demonic and sinister. Instead, he seemed to be an average man, medium-sized, slender, middle-aged, with receding hair, ill-fitting teeth, and nearsighted eyes. Based on numerous documents and interviews, Arendt makes the conclusion that Eichmann wasn't really someone who was doing evil for the sake of evil itself. He wasn't an anti-Semite or profoundly indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda. Instead, he was just a man executing orders. Everything he did was very much according to the law. Arendt says, whatever he did, as far as he could see, as a law-abiding citizen. He did his duty, as he told the police and the court over and over again. He not only obeyed orders, he also obeyed the law. Besides acting according to the law, the banality which Arendt speaks about in her book includes a kind of thoughtlessness. Not only Eichmann was not a demonic being, but he also wasn't quite realizing the impact of his actions executed according to superior orders. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. Now, if we come back to Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, it seems like Rudolf Höss and his family from the movie embody exactly this kind of banality. They're not shown as demons living in hell or villains always dreaming of massacres. Instead, they just casually live their lives despite being criminals. We are shown how they sunbathe, ride the boat, walk in the garden, dry their clothes, etc. So it really seems like they're a great example of this kind of banality, and as I mentioned before, a ridiculous amount of people have written about this. But from the moment that I saw this movie, I've been strongly doubting that Glazer really meant to implement Hannah Arendt's idea as is in his film and to show the banality of evil in the Nazis. And to find out why, let's go a level deeper. Since the time that Hannah Arendt's book was published, it has been getting quite some criticism from the historians and from the other witnesses. For example, Bettina Stangenet, in her 2011 book Eichmann Before Jerusalem, takes into account some more historical documents and argues that there was actually nothing banal about Adolf Eichmann. She bases this conclusion on some little-known interviews of Eichmann from the 1950s called the Sassin Tapes. There Eichmann talks with other exiled Nazis and provides a new look on who he really was. In one of the tapes he says, "I said this, and I tell you this as a conclusion to our matters, I, the cautious bureaucrat. That was me, yes indeed, but I would like to expand on the issue of the cautious bureaucrat, somewhat to my own detriment. This cautious bureaucrat was attended by a fanatical warrior fighting for the freedom of my blood. And now I want to tell you, as a conclusion to all these records, for we will soon be finished, I must first tell you, I have no regrets." There is a lot more told by Eichmann along similar lines, which shows that, in fact, he was nowhere near thoughtlessness. On the contrary, he knew exactly how many people he had killed, and he didn't regret it. Moreover, he is also very much aware of his public image as the cautious bureaucrat, which he seems to use for his own benefit, but in the close circles he confides that it's only an image, and that in fact the image of the bureaucrat is used to hide his real identity as a fanatic warrior. Stangenet also argues that this ability to play a role in each new situation is very characteristic of Eichmann as a person in general. Eichmann acted out a new role for every stage of his life, for each new audience and every new aim. The only one of Eichmann's roles to have become really well known is the one he performed in Jerusalem. The intention is obvious: he was doing his best to stay alive and to justify his actions. So, taking this into account, we should be very careful when reading Arendt's account of Eichmann in Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem he was nothing but an actor playing the role of an innocent and thoughtless bureaucrat. In the same manner that this book takes a more detailed look at Eichmann's life and actions, we can also notice that Rudolf Höss and his family in the zone of interest only appear to be banal, but are in fact nothing like that. You can see that in the many details of the movie. Take this micro dialogue that we accidentally overhear in one of the episodes.
Und ratet mal, wo ich das hier nutzen kann. Eine Zahnpasta.
Ja, raffiniert muss man sein.
Ja, das kann man.
We are never told where the characters took their toothpaste from or who must have been clever, but we do realize that this dialogue is about stealing from the prisoners of the concentration camp. This kind of mismatch between the calm and cool-headed attitude of the characters and their absolutely vicious acts surely doesn't speak about their banality, but rather about their ability to make crimes seem like something ordinary, like something everyday. They certainly do know that they're stealing from the prisoners, but they decide not to take it seriously. It's definitely not the thoughtlessness or conformity Arendt speaks about in her book. And the whole movie is actually structured around this idea that the criminal would always want to make some kind of barrier between themselves and the crime, so that there is some space where the crime is done, of course by the criminal himself, and there's another space where the criminal lives an ordinary and peaceful life. The two spaces are clearly separated and show that there is nothing in common between the space of crime and the space of life. Glazer shows this brilliantly by making the wall almost another character in the movie. We always hear some kind of constant noise coming from behind the wall. Sometimes it's children crying, sometimes it's rifles firing, but we never see what's behind the wall. And that is because, well, the family simply don't want to see that. This is another thing that makes the movie almost a masterpiece. When we look at the characters, we look at them from their own perspective, not from the perspective of the historian or of the judge. So it's no surprise that all of the cameras in the movie are static. It's to make us feel as if there are no operators, which implies that it was the family themselves who put those cameras around the house in the first place, so that we see the characters precisely in the way that they want us to see them. And they want us to see them as innocent. And that wish not to show the crime happens also in the rare cases when the action of the movie goes beyond the mansion. One of the most difficult shots for me was when Hers goes out to perform his duty in the camp and oversee the execution, and we're never shown the execution itself, we're only shown the proud face of the commandant. The camera here, as it is elsewhere, is on the side of the criminal, and it's logical that it's never the crime itself that it wants to show. The most striking episode that shows that there was really nothing banal about Rudolf Höss is probably the scene when he and his wife are almost ecstatic after hearing about the deportation of the 700,000 of Hungarian Jews and about the fact that it would be Höss himself who would oversee their extermination. This really leaves the question of his banality far behind, because he definitely seems to understand and look forward to being a criminal. Taking this into account, we may say that the movie doesn't embody the ideas of Hannah Arendt, but rather rewrites them and criticizes them. Its very important statement seems to be that the criminal, however great the crime that they have committed, is always going to try to seem banal and conformant in order to escape justice. They're always going to try to refuse their own subjectivity, to say that they were only executing orders, and besides that, they would argue that they are perfectly normal people. They will never want to seem to be the subjects of their own actions. Of course, this doesn't just tell us something about the Nazi Germany or about the past. One of the most common justifications of the Russians who came to occupy and bring terror to Ukraine is that they were simply executing orders of the superiors, that they allegedly didn't have any choice. So according to this logic, you don't blame the soldiers, but you blame the people above them, the commanders. But then the commanders are also executing orders, so you really need to go to the generals, and then the ministers, and then the president himself, at which point they make up some weird conspiracy theory about the Kremlin towers and some anonymous people who really rule the country. Which also means there's no one to blame if you follow this logic of superior orders and banality of evil. So Glazer seems to come up with a way to solve this vicious circle of irresponsibility by showing that whether evil is banal or not isn't really important. What is important is that the evil and the criminal is always going to try to seem banal and irresponsible, and therefore it's the task of the judge not to fall into this. And since we're watching the movie, it's us who are supposed to be the judges.